Marcus Webb had made exactly 3 mistakes in his life. First, he'd signed up for the Galactic Military Academy exchange program. Second, he'd actually shown up. And third, well, he was about to find out what that one was. The lecture hall looked like someone had taken a United Nations meeting and fed it hallucinogens. To his left sat Vextar, a 7-foot reptilian whose scales shimmered with an oily rainbow sheen. The guy had been bragging about his species' conquest of the Andromeda Spiral for the past 3 months, and Marcus was pretty sure Vextar practiced his intimidating hiss in the mirror every morning. On his right, Luna 9 sat perfectly upright, her chrome plating reflecting the room's bioluminescent lighting. She was an artificial intelligence housed in a sleek humanoid body, and she had the personality of a tax auditor who'd just discovered you'd been claiming your cat as a dependent. Every calculation she made was precise to 17 decimal places, and she reminded everyone of this fact roughly every 5 minutes. Behind them, Gribble quivered in what Marcus generously assumed was excitement. The gelatinous blob creature changed colors when nervous, and right now he was cycling through shades of purple that would make a bruise jealous. Gribble's species had evolved on a planet where everything tried to eat everything else, which explained why he jumped at shadows and apologized for existing at least 12 times per class period. Professor Cromack strode to the front of the room, his forearms gesticulating wildly. The insectoid alien's compound eyes swept across his students like searchlights hunting for escaped prisoners. When he spoke, his voice buzzed with the authority of someone who'd probably written the textbook on advanced interstellar warfare, then written the textbook about writing textbooks on advanced interstellar warfare. "Students," Cromack announced, his mandibles clicking with satisfaction, "today marks your final examination. You will have 48 standard hours to design and construct the ultimate weapon, using any resources available in this academy." Vextar's tail twitched with predatory excitement. Luna 9's optical sensors whirred as they adjusted focus. Gribble turned a particularly alarming shade of chartreuse and made a sound like a deflating balloon. Marcus yawned. "The parameters are simple," Cromack continued. "Maximum effectiveness, minimum restrictions. Your weapons will be tested against standard Academy defensive targets. The student with the most successful design will receive priority placement in the Galactic Defense Corps." Around the room, alien minds were already churning with possibilities. Marcus could practically hear the gears turning, the synapses firing, the quantum processors calculating trajectories and energy outputs. Vextar was muttering something about plasma cores and molecular disruption fields. Luna 9 had already pulled up 17 different holographic blueprints and was cross-referencing them with materials databases. Marcus scratched his chin and wondered if the Academy cafeteria served anything that resembled actual food. The tour of the fabrication facilities felt like being dragged through a science fiction theme park, designed by someone with unlimited funding and questionable taste. Professor Cromack led them through corridors lined with workshops that hummed with enough energy to power a small planet. "Behold," Cromack buzzed proudly, gesturing toward a room filled with crystalline matrices that pulsed with inner light. "Our quantum-forged chambers, capable of manipulating matter at the subatomic level." Vextar's eyes gleamed like a kid who'd just discovered his parents' credit card. "Perfect for crafting a plasma containment system. My ancestors used crude fusion weapons to glass entire continents on Kepler 442b. "How charmingly primitive," Luna 9 replied, her voice carrying the exact tone of someone complimenting a finger painting. "My creators developed singularity bombs that could collapse stars into pocket dimensions. I calculate a 73.6% probability of recreating the design with these facilities." Gribble made a sound like a nervous hiccup. "My people mostly just hid in caves and hoped the scary things would go away." Marcus nodded approvingly. "Solid strategy, honestly." They moved through laboratories filled with materials that shouldn't exist, according to most physics textbooks. Metamorphic alloys that changed their molecular structure on command. Crystallized dark matter that bent space-time around itself like a cosmic yoga instructor. Energy cores that contained the concentrated fury of dying neutron stars. "The previous graduating class," Cromack explained with obvious pride, "produced a student who successfully weaponized a controlled black hole. Another created a virus that could corrupt quantum encryption, and one particularly brilliant individual designed a weapon that could retroactively prevent an enemy from ever being born." Vextar puffed up his chest scales. "Child's play. The Serpentine hegemony has been perfecting the art of warfare for millennia. We learned to split atoms while your species was still discovering fire, human." Marcus raised an eyebrow. Actually, we discovered fire around the same time we learned to throw rocks really hard at things that annoyed us. Worked pretty well, all things considered. Throwing rocks, Luna 9 computed aloud, represents an approximately 0.001% technological advancement over basic cellular function. How delightfully quaint. Hey now, Marcus said, his voice carrying just enough false hurt to make it clear he wasn't actually offended. We also learned to sharpen sticks. Don't sell us short on the stick sharpening front. We got really, really good at that. The tour continued past workshops where students from previous years had apparently tried to one-up each other in the most ridiculously over-engineered death machine competition. There were blast marks on the walls that looked suspiciously like they'd been made by weapons powerful enough to crack moons in half. Vextar gestured dismissively at the scorch marks. Sloppy containment protocols. A properly designed weapon should channel destruction with surgical precision, not spray devastation like some barbaric explosive device. Statistical analysis confirms, Luna 9 added, that weapons designed by organic lifeforms have a 47% higher failure rate than those created by artificial intelligences. Emotional thinking leads to suboptimal engineering decisions. Marcus looked around the gleaming facilities, taking in the impossible technology and listening to his classmates' casual discussions about planet-cracking superweapons. He made a mental note to maybe send a postcard home, if there was still a home to send it to after this class was over. The 48-hour countdown began with all the subtlety of a supernova in a library. Holographic timers materialized above each workstation, their red digits ticking down like doomsday clocks, designed by someone with a flair for the dramatic. Vextar claimed the largest fabrication bay, and immediately began pulling up schematics that looked like they'd been designed by a committee of mad scientists with unlimited budgets and questionable ethics. His clawed fingers danced across holographic interfaces, requisitioning enough exotic matter to build a small space station. "Behold," he hissed to anyone within earshot, "the Mark 7 stellar decimator, capable of channeling the raw fury of a collapsing star into a focused beam of annihilation." Luna 9 had taken over 3 adjacent workstations and linked them into a processing cluster that hummed with computational power. Her optical sensors flickered as she ran probability matrices that would have made a quantum computer weep with envy. "I am constructing what I have designated the entropy cascade generator," she announced, with the satisfaction of someone who'd just solved a crossword puzzle written in ancient Sumerian. "It will systematically unravel the molecular bonds of any target, reducing complex matter to its constituent atoms through controlled thermodynamic decay." Gribble had found the smallest workstation in the corner and was nervously cycling through design templates like someone browsing a menu at a restaurant where everything looked either terrifying or inedible. His gelatinous form quivered with each decision, occasionally emitting small squeaks of distress. Marcus wandered through the chaos like a tourist who'd taken a wrong turn and ended up at a nuclear physics convention. Students from other species worked frantically around him, their projects growing more elaborate by the hour. A crystalline being was growing what appeared to be a weaponized forest. A gas form entity was somehow sculpting pure energy into geometric patterns that hurt to look at directly. The noise was incredible. Plasma cutters shrieked as they sliced through materials that existed in 7 dimensions simultaneously. Quantum hammers rang against anvils made of crystallized space-time. Somewhere in the distance, someone was apparently teaching a tame black hole to sit and stay. Marcus found himself in front of a materials requisition terminal that looked like it could order anything from antimatter to crystallized luck. He scrolled through the catalog with growing amazement. Need some weaponized dark energy? Available in 6 different flavors. Looking for metals that existed only in theoretical physics textbooks? In stock and ready for immediate delivery. He closed the catalog and kept walking. 24 hours in, his classmates were making serious progress on their doomsday devices. Vextar's plasma containment chamber was taking shape, a sleek cylindrical horror that pulsed with barely contained stellar fury. Luna 9's entropy generator resembled a geometric nightmare designed by someone who'd studied both advanced mathematics and torture device architecture. Even Gribble had managed to create something that looked vaguely weapon-like, though it appeared to be powered by his own anxiety, which meant it would probably never run out of fuel. Marcus, meanwhile, had discovered the academy cafeteria. It served something that was technically food, though he suspected it had been translated through several languages and possibly a few dimensions before reaching his plate. Still, the chairs were surprisingly comfortable, and he spent a pleasant hour watching his classmates work themselves into various states of technological frenzy through the large viewing windows. It was during his second cup of what the menu optimistically called coffee that Marcus noticed the chair he was sitting on. Standard Academy furniture built to accommodate the wildly different anatomies of a dozen species. The legs were solid hardwood, real earth oak if he wasn't mistaken. Probably chosen because it was one of the few materials that wouldn't trigger anyone's allergies, dietary restrictions, or dimensional phasing issues. He rocked back slightly, testing the chair's construction. Solid joinery but not overly reinforced. The kind of practical design that prioritized function over form. Built to last but not built to withstand, say, a determined human with too much time on his hands. Through the cafeteria's floor-to-ceiling windows he could see Vextar's workstation. The reptilian had surrounded himself with enough warning holograms to stock a small safety equipment store. His stellar decimator was beginning to look less like a weapon and more like a very angry Christmas tree, complete with blinking lights that probably indicated various forms of imminent catastrophe. As Marcus watched, one of those lights turned from yellow to red. Then several others joined it. Vextar's tail began lashing frantically as he dove into damage control mode, his claws flying across emergency shutdown protocols. Luna 9's entropy generator wasn't faring much better. The geometric nightmare had developed what appeared to be a structural instability that was causing it to phase in and out of visible reality. Every few seconds, parts of the device would simply stop existing, which Marcus figured was probably not an intentional design feature. Even Gribble's anxiety-powdered contraption was having issues. The poor blob creature had worked himself into such a state of nervous energy that his weapon was now glowing bright orange and making sounds like a tea kettle having an existential crisis. Marcus stood up, walked around his chair, and gave one of the legs an experimental shake. It wobbled slightly. The joint had a bit of give to it, but the wood itself was solid. He crouched down and examined the construction more closely. The leg was attached with a traditional mortise and tenon joint, reinforced with what looked like standard wood glue and a couple of screws. Simple, effective, and probably designed by someone who understood that sometimes the old ways worked just fine. He glanced back at the chaos beyond the windows. Vextar was now completely obscured by emergency holographs, their red glow making his workstation look like the command center of a ship that was definitely not going to make it to the next star system. Luna 9 had 3 different diagnostic programs running simultaneously, their combined chatter creating a sound like a flock of very disappointed robots. Marcus reached into his pocket and pulled out his utility knife. It wasn't much, just a basic folding blade he'd carried since his first camping trip at age 12. The kind of simple tool that had probably been invented about 5 minutes after humans first figured out how to chip flint into sharp edges. He positioned the knife at the joint where the chair leg met the seat, angled it just right, and began to work. The wood glue had aged enough to lose some of its grip, and the screws were standard Phillips heads that backed out easily enough. It took maybe 3 minutes of careful prying and unscrewing before the leg came free with a satisfying pop. The piece of oak in his hands was roughly 3 feet long, slightly tapered, and had a nice heft to it. One end still bore the tenon joint, a squared-off section about 2 inches long that had been shaped to fit perfectly into its corresponding socket. The other end was smooth and rounded. Marcus walked over to one of the cafeteria's food preparation areas and found what he was looking for. A manual knife sharpener, the old-fashioned kind with crossed steel rods that had probably been included because some species still preferred to prepare their food the traditional way. He set to work on the rounded end of the chair leg, drawing the wood across the steel at a careful angle. The oak was hard enough to hold a good edge but soft enough to shape without too much effort. Wood shavings curled away from the blade as he worked, falling to the floor in pale spirals. 10 minutes later he had a point, not just any point, a proper spear point, sharp enough to punch through armor, long enough to provide good penetration, and weighted just right for the balance of the shaft. He hefted the finished product, testing its balance. The weight distribution was nearly perfect. The oak was seasoned and strong, unlikely to snap under stress. The point was sharp enough to shave with and positioned at exactly the right angle for maximum penetration efficiency. Through the windows, he could see that Vextar's stellar decimator had begun smoking. Not the good kind of smoking that indicated controlled fusion reactions, but the bad kind that suggested expensive components were rapidly becoming expensive paperweights. Marcus gave his improvised spear a few practice thrusts, testing the way it moved through the air. The balance was so natural it felt like an extension of his arm. He twirled it once, just because he could, and smiled at the soft whistle it made as it cut through the air. Well, he said to himself, admiring his handiwork, that ought to do it. The testing arena looked like someone had crossed a weapons range with a gladiatorial coliseum and then asked an interior decorator with serious psychological issues to make it more intimidating. Reinforced barriers rose 30 feet high, their surfaces scarred by what Marcus assumed were the failed experiments of previous classes. The air hummed with energy shields, designed to contain everything from runaway antimatter to weaponized emotion. Professor Cromack stood at the center of it all, flanked by a panel of faculty judges, who looked like they'd been recruited from the most likely to destroy civilizations section of the galactic phone book. Their compound eyes, optical sensors, and various other sensory apparatus focused on the students with the intensity of critics at a wine tasting where the wine might explode. "Students," Cromack buzzed, his voice carrying across the arena with amplified authority, "you will demonstrate your weapons against our standard defensive targets. Each target represents increasing levels of protection commonly encountered in modern warfare." The targets materialized in a row across the far end of the arena. First was a simple ballistic dummy, essentially a scarecrow made of materials that could shrug off small arms fire. Second was an energy-shielded mannequin that flickered with protective barriers. Third was a heavily armored combat drone that looked like it could double as a small tank. Vextar strutted forward first, dragging his stellar decimator behind him on a repulsor sled. The weapon had grown during the night, apparently fed by his ambitions and a concerning amount of exotic matter. It now resembled a cannon designed by someone who thought regular cannons weren't nearly explosive enough. "Behold," he announced, his voice carrying the confidence of someone who had never experienced true failure. "The Mark 7 Stellar Decimator, capable of channeling the fury of dying stars into focused annihilation." He activated the weapon with a flourish. Warning lights blazed across its surface like a very angry Christmas tree. Energy readings spiked on the arena's monitoring systems. The air itself seemed to hold its breath. Then nothing happened. Vextar frowned and tried again. More warning lights, more energy spikes, and what sounded suspiciously like the mechanical equivalent of confused whimpering. The weapon's central core began to glow ominously, cycling through colors that didn't have names in most languages. "Perhaps a minor calibration issue," Vextar muttered, his tail lashing nervously. He jabbed at the control interface with increasing desperation. The Stellar Decimator responded by making a sound like a dying whale, belching a cloud of multicolored smoke and promptly shutting down entirely. Several warning holograms appeared around it, their messages roughly translating to "Please, step away from the expansive mistake." Luna 9 glided forward next, her entropy generator hovering beside her on precise anti-gravity fields. The geometric nightmare had somehow become even more geometrically nightmarish overnight, its angles now existing in dimensions that made Marcus's eyes water just looking at them. "Observe," she announced with digital precision. "Controlled thermodynamic decay at the molecular level. This device will systematically unravel the atomic bonds of any target, reducing complex matter to its base components." She activated her creation with the confidence of someone whose calculations had never been wrong. The entropy generator hummed to life, its impossible angles rotating through configurations that hurt to think about. A beam of what looked like crystallized mathematics shot toward the first target. For a moment it seemed to work perfectly. The ballistic dummy began to shimmer and fade as its molecular structure came apart. Then the beam curved back on itself, apparently deciding that the entropy generator looked like a much more interesting target than some boring mannequin. Luna 9's expression shifted from digital satisfaction to binary panic as her weapon began enthusiastically deconstructing itself. "Error, error," she announced unnecessarily, as her masterpiece folded in on itself and disappeared with a sound like reality filing a complaint. Gribble approached with his anxiety-prowling device, which had overnight evolved into something that looked like a disco ball designed by someone having a nervous breakdown. The poor blob creature was vibrating with such nervous energy that his weapon was practically levitating on its own power. He squeaked. "I call it the worry ray. It's powered by existential dread and social anxiety." He aimed the device at the targets and fired. A beam of what could only be described as weaponized neurosis shot across the arena. The first target immediately began having what appeared to be an identity crisis, questioning its purpose and wondering if anyone really appreciated the sacrifices it made. Then the beam reflected off the energy-shielded mannequin and bounced around the arena like a ping-pong ball made of pure social awkwardness. Within seconds, everyone in the arena was feeling vaguely uncomfortable about conversations they'd had 15 years ago. The worry ray, apparently satisfied with its work, exploded in a shower of glittery anxiety that made everyone present suddenly remember every embarrassing thing they'd ever done. Professor Cromack turned to Marcus with the weary expression of someone who had spent his career watching promising students turn exotic matter into very expensive paperweights. "Mr. Webb," he buzzed, "please present your weapon." Marcus stood up from the bench where he'd been sitting, casually picked up his sharpened chair leg, and walked to the firing line. He could feel the collective attention of the faculty panel, the other students, and what felt like half the academy focused on him and his piece of pointed wood. He hefted the spear, testing its balance one final time. The weight was perfect, the point was sharp, and the oak felt solid and reliable in his hands. It was, he reflected, probably the most honest weapon in the room. No exotic matter, no impossible physics, no components that existed in theoretical dimensions. Just good wood, shaped well, with a point that could punch holes in things. He drew back his arm, feeling the familiar motion that humans had been perfecting since they first figured out that sharp sticks could solve a surprising number of problems. The first target was about 30 meters away, an easy throw for anyone who'd grown up playing baseball or javelin, or just throwing rocks at things that needed throwing rocks at. Marcus relieved. The spear flew through the air with the simple elegance of a solution that had worked for thousands of years. It struck the first target dead center, punching through the ballistic-resistant materials with a solid thunk that somehow managed to sound more satisfying than all the exotic energy weapons combined. But it didn't stop there. The oak shaft, driven by good leverage and better aim, continued its journey. The point emerged from the back of the first target and immediately encountered the second, the energy-shielded mannequin. The protective barriers, designed to deflect plasma bolts and particle beams, had apparently never been programmed to deal with a pointy stick moving at high velocity. The spear punched through the energy shield like it wasn't there, because from the spear's perspective, it really wasn't. Energy shields were great at stopping energy weapons. They had no idea what to do with 3 feet of sharpened oak traveling at considerable speed. The second target toppled backward, and the spear continued its triumphant journey until it encountered the third target, the heavily armored combat drone. This should have been where the demonstration ended. The drone's armor was designed to withstand direct hits from military-grade weapons. But Marcus had put just the right amount of spin on the throw, and the spear hit at exactly the right angle. It found the drone's primary sensor array, essentially its eyes, and punched through the optical housing into the delicate electronics beyond. The combat drone, suddenly blind and confused, began spinning in place while making sounds like a very large robot having a very small breakdown. Marcus brushed his hands together with the satisfaction of someone who had just solved a complicated problem using basic principles and good aim. "Any questions?" he asked. The silence that followed was the kind of profound quiet usually reserved for moments when the universe itself pauses to reconsider some of its fundamental assumptions. The arena's energy readings had returned to baseline levels, the warning klaxons had stopped wailing, and even the combat drone had ceased its electronic sobbing. Everyone, faculty, students, and the various automated systems monitoring the demonstration seemed to be processing what they had just witnessed. Professor Cromack was the first to break the silence. His compound eyes shifted focus multiple times, as if he was trying to make sure he was seeing the same reality as everyone else. When he spoke, his voice carried the tone of someone who had just watched a child solve a quantum mechanics problem using finger paints. "Mr. Webb," he buzzed slowly, each word carefully measured, "your weapon appears to have successfully neutralized all 3 targets using what can only be described as a pointed stick." "Well," Marcus replied, walking over to retrieve his spear from where it protruded through the combat drone's optical array. "Technically, it's a sharpened chair leg, but yeah, pretty much." Vextar's scales had shifted to a shade of green that Marcus was pretty sure indicated either nausea or existential crisis. The reptilian's tail twitched as he stared at the wreckage of his stellar decimator, then at Marcus's simple wooden spear, then back at his expensive pile of smoking components. "But," Vextar stammered, his usual arrogance replaced by genuine confusion, "how did it penetrate the energy barriers? The calculations clearly show that solid projectiles should be deflected by standard defensive matrices." Marcus worked his spear free from the drone's sensor housing and examined the point. Still sharp, still intact, with just a few scratches to show for its journey through 3 different types of military-grade protection. "Energy shields are designed to stop energy weapons," he explained, testing the spear's balance again. "They work by creating electromagnetic fields that deflect charged particles and redirect plasma streams. But this," he held up the chair leg, "isn't energy. It's just matter moving really fast in a straight line." The shield doesn't know how to grab onto something that isn't trying to interact with it electromagnetically. Luna 9's optical sensors whirred as she processed this information. Her voice, when she spoke, had lost its usual mechanical certainty and carried what could only be described as digital bewilderment. "But the material science is all wrong," she protested. "Organic cellulose structures cannot possibly maintain structural integrity under the stress loads required for armor penetration. My calculations indicate a 97.4% probability of catastrophic failure upon impact." Marcus shrugged. "Your calculations probably assumed perfect laboratory conditions. This is oak. It's been growing in dirt and weather for decades, dealing with wind stress and seasonal changes. It's not perfect, but it's tough. And sometimes, tough beats perfect." He walked over to where the first target still stood, his spear having passed completely through it. The hole was clean and round, punched through ballistic-resistant materials that were supposed to stop military ammunition. "The thing is," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the patient tone of someone explaining basic concepts to very smart people who had somehow missed the obvious, "you all started with the assumption that more complicated equals more effective. But sometimes the simplest solution is the one that works." Professor Cromack approached the demonstration area, his forearms gesticulating as he examined the targets. The ballistic dummy had a perfect hole through its center. The energy-shielded mannequin lay on its back, its protective systems still trying to figure out what had happened to it. The combat drone sat in the corner, occasionally emitting small electronic whimpers. "Fascinating," Cromack murmured, his voice carrying genuine scientific interest. The kinetic energy transfer was remarkably efficient. No wasted power, no exotic matter consumption, no complex targeting systems required. Gribble, who had been quietly changing colors throughout the entire demonstration, finally spoke up. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the hushed arena it carried clearly. "So the human just threw a stick at the problem until it went away?" "Pretty much," Marcus confirmed, though to be fair it was a really well-made stick. The faculty panel had been conferring among themselves in a mixture of languages, mathematical equations, and what sounded like philosophical arguments about the nature of effective weapon design. Finally, they reached some kind of consensus. Professor Cromack stepped forward, his mandibles clicking in what Marcus had learned was the insectoid equivalent of a ceremonial announcement. "Students," he declared, his voice carrying across the arena with renewed authority, "today's exercise was designed to test more than just your ability to build weapons. It was intended to evaluate your problem-solving approaches, your understanding of practical applications, and your ability to think beyond conventional parameters." Vexstar's tail drooped. Lunanang's optical sensors dimmed. Gribble turned a shade of blue that probably indicated resignation mixed with relief. "Mr. Webb," Cromack continued, "your solution demonstrates several crucial principles that your classmates overlooked. First, simplicity of design often correlates with reliability of function. Second, understanding your target's defenses is more important than maximizing your weapon's theoretical capabilities. And third, sometimes the most effective tool is the one that your enemy doesn't expect." Marcus nodded, accepting the compliment with the grace of someone who had never doubted that pointy sticks were a viable military strategy. "The Galactic Defense Corps," Cromack announced, "values practical thinking above theoretical complexity. Mr. Webb, you have earned priority placement in their Advanced Combat Engineering program." As the other students filed out of the arena, their expressions ranging from confused to dejected to quietly impressed, Marcus stood alone with his chair-leg spear. He gave it one last experimental thrust, enjoying the way it cut through the air with purposeful efficiency. He thought about his classmates and their elaborate failures. Vexstar with his stellar fury trapped in crystalline matrices, Luna 9 with her mathematical perfection that had somehow calculated itself into non-existence, Gribble with his anxiety-pounded disco ball of doom. All of them brilliant in their own ways. All of them capable of understanding physics and engineering principles that would make Earth's greatest scientists weep with envy, and all of them completely missing the point. Sometimes, Marcus reflected as he headed toward the exit, the best solution wasn't the most advanced one. Sometimes, it was just the one that worked. He paused at the arena's entrance and looked back at the three targets. Still neutralized. Still thoroughly defeated by a piece of furniture he'd modified with a pocket knife. "Next time," he called back to the empty arena, "I'm bringing rocks." The combat drone responded with a small, defeated beep that somehow managed to sound like mechanical agreement. Marcus Webb, Armed with nothing more than sharpened wood and the accumulated wisdom of a species that had spent millennia figuring out increasingly creative ways to poke holes in things, walked out of the arena and into his future as the galaxy's most practical warrior. Behind him, the janitor drones began the delicate process of cleaning up exotic matter residue, theoretical physics fragments, and one very confused combat robot that kept asking itself why it hadn't seen the pointy stick coming.